Good afternoon. We'll call the Senate Jobs and Economic Growth, Finance and Policy Committee to order. We do have a quorum. Quorum is present. So good afternoon, members. I hope everybody had a nice weekend. Today we have a very interesting presentation, and if our testifiers would like to come up, feel free to do so. And this is always one of the most interesting presentations that I look forward to each year. So I'm not sure the order, but you guys please proceed, and just before you go on with your presentation, if you can just state your name for the record, and then continue on with your presentation.
Sure. Thank you very much, Chair and members of the committee. I'm Laura Kalambokidis. I'm the State Economist. Or am I not close enough?
All right. Can we get a page and make sure the microphones are on? Okay. So I'm told that the mics are probably on. Just pull it as close as you can.
Closer to it?
There
Is
you
that
go.
better?
That's much better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Again, for the record, I'm Laura Kalambokidis. I'm the State Economist and a professor of applied economics at the University of Minnesota. I'm going to talk about Minnesota's economic outlook in very broad terms, with a focus on the labor market and workforce issues, which are coloring the current economic climate in Minnesota. And then I will pass it on to Steve Hine from DEED, who will then pass it on to Susan Brower, our state demographer. So I'm going to start with a broad picture of Minnesota's economy, and again, focusing on the labor market. What we've done here is we've distributed the employment in the state of Minnesota across major industrial sectors. And this is to give you a picture of what the industry mix is in Minnesota, which determines a lot of what happens in the state economy. So from top to bottom, we have the distribution of employment across industrial sectors, where the length of the bar in each case is the percentage of our total state employment that is in that sector. And we have the dark bars are for Minnesota and the light bars are for the United States. And this is a way for you to compare Minnesota's industry mix with the United States industry mix. And just visually by looking at it, you can see that roughly, with a few exceptions that I'll talk about, roughly our industry mix mirrors that of the United States. And that is to say that Minnesota has a diverse industrial profile. So when people talk about the diverse economy in Minnesota, this is what they're talking about, that our employment is spread across a range of industries that looks a lot like how they are distributed in the United States. That diverse economic base gives us a couple of things. And one thing that it does is it helps the state economy be more resilient through downturns. So that when you have a lot of industries represented, and we're not overly dependent on any particular industry, in particular an industry that is highly volatile, that means that the economy can recover more quickly from downturns, because it's the same idea as having diverse financial portfolio. So you diversify your financial portfolio so that if one part of your portfolio isn't doing very well, another part of your portfolio might be doing well, and then that will even out in the long run, and you'll have a more stable growth. And so in an economic sense, it means that when one industry is contracting and shedding workers, another industry might be able to pick those workers up. So Minnesota does tend to be resilient. We tend not to ride booms and busts as much as, for instance, energy states do. And it also has helped Minnesota to recover from downturns, in particular the Great Recession, faster than the United States. We recovered the jobs lost from the Great Recession about 8 months ahead of the United States. Now, there are some places where the bars are not the same length, or not very close to the same length. Let me talk about a couple of those. The first one is that top industry sector, education and health care services. So that is not public education. That's not K through 12 or the public university system. That's private education. So it's for-profit education and private universities. And it's health care services. For Minnesota, that bar is dominated by healthcare services. It's about 85% healthcare services. And if I misspeak on my employment numbers, Steve is here to correct me. So you can think of that bar as Minnesota's healthcare service bar. So we are overrepresented relative to the United States in that sector. So we are a healthcare state, and that's an important employer, that industry. A couple of other places where we are overrepresented relative to the United States, about the middle of the chart, you can see financial activities. We're overrepresented relative to the U.S. there, and that is another important sector in the state. Banks, insurance companies, all of that. Those are good jobs. Those tend to be good jobs. And then if you also look a couple of, or just above financial activities is manufacturing of durables. So durable goods manufacturing, we're overrepresented relative to the U.S. there. So we are a manufacturing state. Manufacturing matters to Minnesota. We are overrepresented relative to the U.S., but not as much as some of the other Great Lakes states. So that's something that has helped Minnesota in recovering from the Great Recession, is that we are not as dependent on durable manufacturing as some of our other states in the Great Lakes region. And then a little further down, you can see manufacturing of non-durables. We're overrepresented there too. So those are sectors that that matter to the state of Minnesota, and generally this diversity helps us to be more resilient. So in addition to resilience, a diverse economic base, you think about some of those healthcare jobs, some of the professional and business services jobs, manufacturing jobs, all sorts of jobs, those also help support relatively high per capita income for the state of Minnesota. So in this chart, we've charted per capita income, which are annual numbers, for Minnesota and the United States. So here, Minnesota is the dark line, the U.S. is the light line. And you can see that we are generally above U.S. regarding per capita income. In 2016, our per capita income was about 105%, or 5% above the U.S. level, and that placed Minnesota about 13th among states. So we have a diverse economy. We have a strong workforce. I'll talk about some of the workforce parameters, and Steve and Susan will talk about some of those as well. And those support relatively high per capita incomes here.
Ms. Kalambokidis, I'm going to stop you just for a moment.
Yep.
Senator Draheim has a question, and members, what we'll do is maybe after each slide, we'll just take a brief pause to see if anyone has any questions. And then, if not, we'll continue to proceed. But Senator Draheim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just had a quick question back on the financial activities and healthcare services. You know, we were above the national average on those. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's affected by government mandates? Do you think that, I mean, do people in the financial service sector have to have more employees on hand to oversee some of the mandates and rules that we pass, and the same with healthcare? Do you think that's a fair assumption?
Ms. Kalambokidis?
Chairman, Senator, members of the committee, that's a very interesting question. And I think, I don't think I could quite answer that. I would have to look at the change over time. So you'd have to look at our representation in those sectors as the regulations changed. So I think you're thinking, for instance, of financial service regulation that require a lot of oversight and a lot of compliance. Same with healthcare. So you'd have to look at how that changed over time and see if banks and insurance companies, then on the other side, hospitals and insurers were growing their compliance divisions, and if that was something that happened here. But that's not specific to Minnesota, so I wouldn't necessarily, if that was happening, I would think that would be happening at the U.S. level too, and so it wouldn't necessarily change our relationship to the U.S. there. But that's an interesting question to look at over time.
Senator Champion.
I noticed when you were talking about the Minnesota's per capita income is above the U.S. How does that apply to people of color? I know when the Star Tribune not long ago articulated with clarity that the income between black and whites, you know, especially have you know, dramatically changed, mm-hmm. or at least in the African American community went down. So I just want to understand how that information ties into this analysis that you have captured on page 2.
Ms. Kalambokidis.
Chairman, Senator, members of the committee, Another really good question, and I should have made clear that when a lot of my slides tend to be looking at the state as a whole, and looking at the state as a whole so that we can see how things changed over time and how we can see how the state compares to the United States over time. But and economists like to look at aggregates and averages for that reason, so we can see how things change over time and to compare across jurisdictions. But looking at aggregates and averages masks important differences between groups. So as you can see, per capita income's growing, and you can see per capita income's higher in the U.S. than Minnesota. That masks differentials within Minnesota's per capita incomes. So the differentials are embedded here. They're kind of masked here, though. I don't have the charts to show those differentials. I think Susan's going to. Were you planning to look at some of that? We weren't planning to present that here, but you're right that those differentials are sort of hidden here.
No other questions? Okay, please proceed. Thank you.
Okay, so another aggregate data point or variable here is unemployment. So this is another way to look at how Minnesota performs relative to the United States. This chart maps the unemployment rate. This is the headline unemployment rate, and we'll talk about some of the details there and dig down a bit there. I'll do some of that, and Steve will do some of that too. But this is the headline unemployment rate. And the light line is the United States and the dark line is Minnesota. Again, we're looking at this over time so that we can compare how things have changed over time and how the Minnesota compares to the U.S. The dark vertical bars are the U.S. recessions. So the white space between the bars is, that's the expansion and recovery periods, or recovery and then expansion periods between the recessions. So you can see that employment rates tick up during the recessions and then come down during the recovery. At the moment, Minnesota's unemployment rate is at 3.9%, below the U.S. rate at 4.7%. That gap has been larger than it is now during this current recovery, as both Minnesota and the United States near what we think of as full employment. Those numbers hit a point where they can't fall much more. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Minnesota is currently about 10th lowest among states regarding the unemployment rate, and so we do outperform a lot of states in this regard. And another thing to note in this chart is looking at that white space, again, of that recovery and expansion period. We're over 7.5 years for the current recovery period since the Great Recession. And that's a long time. So this is a mature economic expansion. It's been going on for quite a while. And as I said, Minnesota recovered the jobs lost from the Great Recession ahead of the United States. So the expansion is even more mature for Minnesota.
And we do
Again,
have a question. I'm
sure.
sorry, we do have a question. Senator Isaacson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Champion had asked you how the demographics break down on some of the statistics we were looking at earlier, and you said you didn't have them with you. It's safe to assume, though, that when we're talking about prognosticating and you're advising the governor and all those other groups, that is included as a natural part of the presentation normally, correct?
Ms. Kalambokidis.
Chairman, Senator, members of the committee, certainly. And with regard to, certainly it is considered, and I do talk about the fact that when I'm presenting overarching numbers or statewide numbers, that those details are masked, and so then we do break up the numbers to look at some of those details. And regarding unemployment, Steve is going to present some of those details for you today.
Follow-up.
Thank you. And maybe I missed it, but I would be very interested in seeing how that breaks down in any of the ways you do crosstabs with demographics, regions, ages, all that stuff, because I think that's maybe even somewhat more important than the overarching theme, because we've got a diverse group of people here. So thank you.
Ms. Kalambokidis.
Certainly, Chairman. So let me move on to looking at another aspect of the labor market. This is this is an illustration sort of the supply and demand within the labor market. We have a circumstance of relatively low unemployment at the same time that we have a high demand for labor in Minnesota. What we're showing here on this chart is the number of unemployed people. So this is people who are classified as unemployed, which means they're not working and they're looking for work. Those are the gray bars. The height of the bar is the number of unemployed people, and the height of the dark bar is job vacancies. So job vacancies are open jobs across the state of Minnesota. And so the difference between those you can think of as an excess supply of labor if the gray bar is ahead of the dark bar. So that's more people looking for work than we have job openings across the state. What you can see is that you can see the recession hit here with a peak of number of unemployed people in growing in 2008 and peaking in 2009. And then you can see the recovery starting to happen as unemployed people are reduced. So that means those unemployed people are being absorbed into the labor market and they're finding jobs as the economy recovers. At the same time as you can see a fairly steady, a little more uneven, but fairly steady increase in the number of job vacancies to the point we're currently at, which is what I refer to as a tight labor market. And by that I mean we have just about as many unemployed job seekers as we have job vacancies statewide. Now, that's not to say that every single person can be matched with a job right now, because there are mismatches regarding geography, where the jobs are and where people are looking for jobs, and there can be mismatches regarding the wages people are seeking and the wages that are being offered, mismatches regarding skill sets. But we do have a situation in Minnesota where the ratio of unemployed workers to job vacancies is about 1.2, which is close to parity. Steve is going to go through some more details on the labor market, but I want to throw out a few more statistics here just to paint this picture a little more clearly of a tight labor market, or a little slack in the labor market. Some observers would look at that headline unemployment rate and say that when that unemployment rate nationally is at about 5%, that's full employment. Full employment doesn't mean everybody's employed. There's always some people that are transitioning and some people that are very difficult to employ. And so 5% is meant to be, is thought of as that full employment level. Well, the United States is below that now at 4.7%, and Minnesota at 3.9% has been below that for quite a while. So using that rough metric of 5% would put us in a tight labor market. And then if you expand the unemployment rate to the next number I have, that what I've got as the plus underemployment rate. So that's going to be that headline unemployment rate, and you add to it marginally attached workers, who are people who are not currently working for work or didn't look for work within the last 2 weeks, but did look for work within the last year. So you add those people in, even though they're not technically counted as unemployed, add those people in, and you add in people who are working part-time but would prefer full-time work. So they're not counted as unemployed, but they're underemployed in the sense that they prefer full-time work. And so observers say that number would be about 9% when the economy is at full employment. But the United States is not quite there, so there remains some slack in the labor market nationwide. But Minnesota is at 7.7%, so well below that. I talked about that ratio of unemployed to job vacancies. That's very tight at 1.2%. And then we'll talk a bit more about the labor force participation rate as well, and the employment rate, which is the number of employed people over a population that is over 16. For both of those numbers, Minnesota is above the United States and high relative to other states. In particular, regarding the labor force participation rate, our labor force participation rate is high relative to the U.S. and high relative to other states, but it's low relative to our own history. It has fallen over time, and I believe that both Steve and Susan will talk a bit more about that.
Ms. Kalambokidis, I have a question, and maybe this is a little bit premature. Maybe one of our other testifiers have the answer, but do you have numbers on the unemployment rate and underemployment rate metro area versus outstate or greater Minnesota, and how those numbers compare?
Chairman, members of the committee, I do not right now. Do you today?
If I may, we do not have underemployment rates for sub-state areas. We do for metro and outstate. I don't have them with me, but I could certainly refer them to you.
Please provide those to the committee, Mr. Hine, when that's available. Thank you.
And then my last slide is just to summarize what these conditions mean for the labor market in Minnesota. So what are the implications of having a seller's labor market here? So industries are competing for workers. So any industry that you're talking to or working with and they're saying we're having trouble finding workers or we're getting creative and figuring out how to find workers, bear in mind that the other industries are doing the same thing. So no industry is operating in a vacuum here. They're, government included, they're all competing for workers right now. And some positions are going to go unfilled as this labor market is tight. And we'll talk about some of the supply constraints there, labor supply issues here. Employers are getting creative to find, train, and retain workers. We see stories in the press quite a bit about employers that are getting creative about advertising, about which populations they're looking at, about transportation, moving potential workers around the state, housing, things like that. And in this environment, job seekers and job switchers can be picky. So I've heard some potential employers saying, gosh, it's hard for me to, I'll make an offer to somebody and I think they're going to start and then they call me and say, no, I've got a better offer somewhere else or I'm going somewhere else. Or I can't keep people for very long, which is a challenge when we're competing with all these other industries. So that's a challenge for employers. And when the labor market is tight like this, employers are expected, and they often do, adopt productivity-enhancing technology and training and approaches. And so they're trying to think of ways to produce the same amount of output, whether it's goods or services, to do the same amount of work, but with fewer people, or to do more work with the same number of people. And so they're purchasing technology, they're investing in new training ideas and new workforce approaches in order to do that. And so as firms invest in technology to improve the productivity of the workers they have, then those workers who are using that technology, their productivity improves because they can do more than they could before, and so they can demand higher wages. So you have pressure for compensation to increase, both because you have supply tight at a time that demand is high, which so the price would go up, but also because employers are going to invest in the things that make each of those workers more valuable, and they can then command higher wages. So I'll finish there and pass the podium to Steve Hine.
Mr. Hine, before you continue, we have a question from Senator Draheim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the graph with low unemployment, high demand for labor, going back during the recession years, do you track how many jobs left the state? I know when we look at the unemployment numbers down below, it's a percentage. But just looking at this graph here, I mean, did we lose jobs during that 8, 9, 10, 11 time period for the state as related to the population?
Ms. Kalambokidis.
Chairman, Senator, we can look at the total number of employed people, so total employment, and the growth in employment over time. And employment did fall during the recession. That's what happens during a recession, and then it's grown during this recovery period. What I cannot say is whether, I'm not sure I even know what it means to say that a job has left the state. So I guess that would mean that
if there's a correlation with companies based out of Minnesota, you know that. I don't know how you'd track that if you'd look at incorporated numbers or what.
Ms.
Chairman,
Kalambokidis.
Senator, I think that it might be possible to look at businesses coming in and businesses starting up or expanding in the state versus businesses that, what I'm not sure we can do is look at businesses that expand or move out of the state, but the Department of Employment and Economic Development would have better handle on that than I.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Mr. Hine, welcome to committee. Please state your name for the record and proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Chairman Miller. Thank you, members of the committee, for having me. Do you want to switch?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
You're one of these.
I think it's on the desktop, isn't it?
That's where I am. I think he is. I'm on the desktop.
There we go. There we go. Good. Again, thanks for having me. My name's Steve Hine. I'm the research director at the Department of Employment and Economic Development. Laura's given me a very good introduction to some of the topics I want to bring to your attention today, primarily around labor market conditions in the state. Let me start with a slide that shows over time here the over-the-year rate of growth in our employment here in blue relative to the nation in red. January marks the 91st month of our current expansion, and Laura mentioned this. This is well above the 58-month post-war average expansion, and as of next month, 92 months will tie the expansion of the 1980s, 82 to 90, as the third longest in our history. Still over a couple of years short of the 120-month expansion of the 1990s, but as Laura pointed out, this is a long and sustained expansion. I think also what's very unique about this expansion has been the persistence, somewhat the stability in our annual job growth over the entire 7.5 years so far. Very rarely has it fallen below 1% or exceeded 2%. Been very persistent in that range over this time. We've been persistently adding around 40,000 jobs annually, and over the course of the recovery now, we're just shy of 300,000 additional jobs, 298,100 jobs higher than we were at the trough. And 95% of those additional jobs have come in the private sector. The strengths, the areas of strengths and weaknesses have differed from the United States, however. This is a chart that also breaks out, as Laura did, employment across our major industrial sectors. But here we're depicting the relative change both in Minnesota and U.S. in the jobs gained, or in some instances lost, since June of 2009 when the official recovery began. Overall, total non-farm job growth has been very consistent. We're up 10.3% versus 10.9% nationally. But the source of those job gains, or that job growth, I should say, have been quite different in terms of some of the areas. We've outpaced the nation quite significantly in areas like logging and mining. And I think it's worth mentioning here that name is perhaps a bit misleading. It does include primarily in Minnesota not so much mining jobs as it is agricultural service jobs. Those are a much more predominant share of the employment in this sector. We have also outpaced the nation by a very significant margin in construction employment. Trade, transportation, utilities, financial activities, professional and business services are all areas in which we have outgrown the nation. We have lagged in some of the other areas like manufacturing, information, education and healthcare, leisure and hospitality, other services, and government. Those are all sectors in which we have lagged the nation in terms of relative job changes over the last 7.5 years. Growth rates don't tell the whole story, though. If we look at the absolute changes in employment since June of...
Sorry to stop you, but before you go to the next slide, Senator Champion has a question, and then I also have one.
What constitutes other services? I noticed.
Yeah.
Mr. Hine?
Thank you, Chairman, Senator. That's just as its name suggests, it's sort of catch-all industry. Here in Minnesota, and I think probably nationally, the largest components of that are auto services, auto mechanics, and beauty salons. Funeral services are another area in there. But it is very much a catch-all that combines a lot of very different kinds of occupations.
Senator Isaacson has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In looking at this graph, I just want to look to the end here. Am I reading this correctly that we have significantly undergrown from what the U.S. government has in terms of the size of government jobs in Minnesota and the amount of government jobs?
Chairman,
Mr.
Senator
Hine.
Isaacson, yes, we have grown government here. If I eyeball that, we are up about 2% since June of 2009, whereas the nation is up about 6%.
All right, thank you.
That's right.
And Mr. Hine, I was going to ask Ms. Kalambokidis earlier, why are educational and health together? Why are they classified together?
Chairman Miller, that's a very frequent question, and I wish I had a better answer than to say that in terms of the overall structure and aggregation, private education was thrown together with healthcare. We can certainly break those out. As Laura mentioned, certainly here in Minnesota, but also nationally, the predominant jobs in that education and healthcare sector are in healthcare services. That would include ambulatory care facilities and hospitals and nursing homes. It also includes social assistance employment. Yeah, it's a somewhat unfortunate aggregation of two very different types of industries. We have that occurring throughout this structure, to be honest with you. Professional and business services, for example, includes everything from corporate headquarters and legal offices to temp help agencies. So, the question about other services is another illustration of how this sometimes is not a very convenient aggregation to analyze, because it oftentimes does combine very disparate kinds of employment. But it does keep the number of bars in a chart to a manageable number,
Sure.
is all I can say.
And Mr. Hine, so public education, both pre-K-12 and higher ed, would that be in the government?
That would be in government, yes.
Thank you.
That's the lion's share of the government employment is at the local level, the public schools, and at the state level, the share that is in the state universities.
Very good. All right, Mr. Hine, please continue.
Thank you. Thank you. So looking at the levels, we see somewhat of a different picture in terms of where we've seen strength in absolute terms. Despite lagging the nation in percentage growth rate terms, most of the jobs that we have added over the course of this recovery have come in the education and health services sector. And again, most of those are in healthcare services. We've seen in ranked order after that a large number of jobs being added to professional business services, trade, transportation, and utilities, and construction. Some of the smaller increases you can see in that chart, the mining and logging, information being the only sector that has lost jobs over the course of the recovery. Information here in Minnesota is comprised primarily of newspaper employment and wired telecommunications, and both of those areas have been losing jobs over the past number of years.
Mr. Hine, we have a question. Senator Isaacson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I'm looking at the number of jobs added, just so I understand the graph correctly, is that after addition and subtraction has been done, or is this just jobs added? Does this include, or are you able to calculate the jobs lost as well, or is it just the jobs added?
Mr. Thank you, Chairman. Senator Isaacson. No, this is a net change.
This is net change.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you.
We base this on a monthly report from employers that simply asks, how many people do you have on your payroll? And so, if an employer reports that they had 110 this month, but only 100 last month, we show a net gain of 10 jobs. We don't know whether that's just 10 new people coming on board or 20 people replacing 10 that have left. So that's a net change. Right.
Mr. Hine?
Okay, thank you. All right. This also gets to a point that Laura was making about this wage growth being a really strong indication of the tightening of our labor market conditions over the last few years. It was one of the perplexing questions that economists had over the course of much of this recovery is, if things are improving as well as they are, as well as some of the data suggests, why aren't we seeing this being translated into rising wages? And it is the case that after failing to sustain any steady growth in wages throughout the first about 5 years of this recovery, we now appear to be seeing just that, as average wages have been up over 4% or more throughout the last half of 2016, and as of December now, this is private sector average wages. As of December, they are up 5.7% over December a year ago, and that's about twice the comparable national rate of wage growth of 2.9%. These wage gains are also occurring across many different sectors in our economy, including some such as professional and business services, financial activities, manufacturing, and construction that are among the better paying to begin with. In cases like leisure and hospitality, that in no doubt, in no small part, is reflecting the impact of minimum wage increases recently. But the breadth of this wage growth and the other indicators of tightening conditions do suggest that maybe this time the wage gains that we have been seeing over the last few months may be here to stay.
Senator Isaacson.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I need to go back 2 slides. I'm just really struck by something, and I want to make sure I understand this correctly.
Sure.
So when I'm looking at the slide that says number of jobs added reveals different strengths, if you were to say which of those bar graphs encompass public sector jobs, which would you say that is? Is it just the far right, government, or any other public sector jobs in the other graph lines?
Chairman, Senator
Mr.
Isaacson, the government job gains there of 9,200, is that? That's the net change in public sector jobs, local, state, and federal level employment levels in the state since June of 2009.
Follow up?
Now, there are certainly jobs in the private sector that are financed through public expenditures, the construction jobs that come from highway projects, for example. But as far as public sector employment goes, that bar on the right is the net change in public sector employment over the course of the last 7.5 years.
Senator Isaacson.
Thank you. Well, I'm just remiss and amazed at how lopsided that is compared to the rhetoric that I continue to hear about the growth of government. I think it's amazing that we're seeing such a robust effort in the private sector, and I appreciate seeing that and that being pointed out in this graph. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions, members? No? Mr. Hine, please continue.
I guess on the topic of other rhetoric, I also want to look at the nature of the changes in the quality of jobs over the course of the recovery. It's frequently been claimed that while job growth has been strong, the jobs themselves may be of lower quality. And one often stated possibility is that the jobs are much more likely to be part-time in nature. So in this chart, I'm showing the share of jobs that are part-time relative to the total. That's the red line. And what you can see there is that before the recession, we had about 24% of our overall employment being part-time. That rose to about 26% during the recession and now has fallen to about 21% most recently in December. So in fact, the share of our jobs that are part-time is lower than it was before the recession hit. In addition, the share of those part-time jobs that are due to so-called economic reasons, that is, due to a bad economy, due to the fact that businesses don't have enough demand for their product, has fallen now to 11.4% after peaking at 22.8%, exactly double what it is most recently. Although it does remain slightly higher than the 9.3% rate just before the recession. But nonetheless, we've seen quite a dramatic improvement in terms of the number of individuals that are working part-time for economic reasons rather than out of choice. This was a question that was raised earlier. Much has also been made of the disparities during the recovery, and they certainly do continue to exist. The unemployment rates for Minnesota's blacks and Hispanics at 8.8% for blacks and 5.3% for Hispanics, respectively, still remain well above the 3.0% rate for white Minnesotans, but do stand well below their respective peaks of 23.3 and 15.7% at the tail end of the recession.
We have a couple questions here, Mr. Hine. First, Senator Draheim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a point of clarification real quick on the part-time workers. Was that under 30 hours, or what was your definition of part-time workers, just for the data?
Mr. Hine.
Chairman, Senator, it's based on a BLS standard of 35 hours per week. 35 hours. Less than 35 hours per week.
Senator Isaacson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm looking at the graph that we, maybe I'm a graph ahead of us. Have we got the unemployment across demographic groups? Did I miss that, or are we on that?
This one?
That's
oh, there
what
we
he's
go,
on
yeah.
right now, yep.
Yeah, so I'm looking, what happened in late 2015 to see an 8-point drop in unemployment with African American? That's what I'm interested in just knowing where it happened. That's kind of an anomaly.
Chairman, Senator,
Hine?
I appreciate that question. I believe it to be a statistical anomaly created by the fact that this survey that these numbers are based on was undergoing a reduction at the time. Minnesota's lost half of the sample in what's called the current population survey that these numbers are based on. And at the time that sample was being reduced, it appears timing-wise to be consistent with these blips. And what strikes me not only is the increase in the black rate at the time, but also the equally precipitous decline in the Hispanic rate. So there was a need to remove sample. We went from sampling about 1,800 households at the beginning of that period over which those changes occurred to sampling 900. And that's the only, and I can't even be confident that that is the explanation, but it does seem to be coincidental, if nothing else, that that's when this blip occurred.
Follow-up, Senator Isaacson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Why would you reduce your sample size? I mean, was there a statistical or administrative reason, or?
Mr.
Chairman, Senator, it is the sample that is funded for this particular survey by the Children's Health Insurance Program, the SCHIP program. And so that was funded in order to get childhood poverty rates for that Children's Health Insurance Program. And on the basis of 2010 census data, it was determined that Minnesota and a number of other states no longer needed that sample in order to adequately estimate. We basically had too low a childhood poverty rate to warrant sample going to this particular survey. I had the same reaction myself.
Any other questions, members? If not, Mr. Hine, please proceed.
Thank you. Last slide is one that I want to bring attention to in anticipation of Susan Brower's labor force projections. I'm sure her story will conclude with a somewhat grim outlook for how many workers we're going to be adding over the next few years. And I did want to look at the characteristics of some of the individuals out there that are of working age that are not participating in our labor markets. And by that, we mean in these terms, they're not either working nor actively and currently seeking work. It is the case that we have 1.3 million individuals that are 16 or older that fall into that category. But there are indicators that suggest that many of them are not likely to be re-entrants, regardless of what might happen in the coming years. Half of them, for example, 651,000 plus of them, are 65 and older. Nearly 19 out of 20, 94.4% of them, that's all of them, indicate in the current population survey that not only were they not looking for a job, they don't want a job. And 2/3 of them have not worked in the past 5 years, if at all. On the other end, only 0.5% of non-participants have currently stated that they are not looking for work over discouragement over their job prospects. That is, they're so-called discouraged workers. At the same time, there are concentrations of these non-participants that may be looked to as a source of some potential re-entrance under the right circumstances. Over half of the non-participants have a high school diploma or less. And considering the dramatic increase in participation that occurs as an individual without a high school diploma, as that person gets a diploma, certainly one potential way of tapping into these 683,000 is to increase the high school graduation rate. At the other end of the education scale, I think a surprising number of non-participants, in fact, do have a college degree, a bachelor's degree or higher. 276,000 individuals with a bachelor's degree or higher are not participating in our labor markets, suggesting that either pure choice or some other barriers besides lack of opportunity are keeping them from participating. Populations of color are a significant pool, although I must say that their share of the total is not disproportionate to their share of the population or the participating labor force. And lastly, over 10% of our non-participants are individuals between 18 and 64 that report some sort of disability. Many of them could potentially be part of that workforce of the future.
All right, I have Senator Little.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hine, the quoted "don't want a job" language kind of stuck out to me. There's been multiple times in my life anyway that I didn't want a job, but I think I always kind of needed one. So I've worked a long time, but I'm just wondering if you have kind of the crosstab of the folks that say they don't want a job, but perhaps financially they would need one.
Mr.
Thank you, Chairman. Senator Little. First of all, this is the actual language in the survey. Do you want a job?
Yeah.
I guess whether that want is driven by necessity or desire is in the mind of the respondent. But this is interpreted anyways as being the explanation that suggests that an individual is not seeking work because that they don't need it, they don't want it. Mm-hmm.
Follow-up, Senator Little?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just think when we're talking to the public about the survey data, it's my opinion that that could be misleading to folks, that maybe we have 1.2 million people that are lazy. But I'm not necessarily sure that that's not what the numbers really reflect when you go deeper. So I'm wondering how would we go about changing that question? And maybe you know the answer to that.
Yeah. Chairman, Senator, you're right. There are many reasons that a person may not want a job. Certainly, a large percentage of these, probably about 651,800 of them, are retired, and they don't want a job for that reason. A good number of them at the younger end of the age distribution don't want a job because they're full-time students. I get the point that I was trying to make with presenting that and the fact that 19 out of 20 non-participants say they don't want a job is not to convey this idea that they are lazy, not at all, but rather that there are many reasons for a person not actively seeking work, and that overcoming those reasons may not be as simple as just hoping for better economic conditions around the corner and seeing that happen.
Senator Isaacson.
Well, I'm going to need to go a little further and maybe put a finer point on what Senator Little said. The frustration that I would have in this, and it isn't like with any particular person, but a person could walk out of this committee and say, can you believe that 94% of people that aren't working because they don't want a job? And they wouldn't be factually incorrect, even though sitting here, we all know that's not what you meant, when half of those folks are retired, right? And so if I was to ask the question, my question would be, how many people of that 1.3 million are able to work, right? Mm-hmm. And just aren't? I think that would be a really significant thing. Probably the most important line item you could pull out of that would be how many folks are just not wanting to do it versus 650,000 that are retirement or, you know, people that are in school. I mean, I think they're really important points, and I get the overall message of don't want a job, but when that's the only thing that's really telling me, I feel like from the list, unless I dig in, really what the reality is, it doesn't help. And long term, because I have to translate what we do here to then go back to my public and have a conversation, once I get into the third sentence, I've often lost them. Right? And so when they see the headline, if someone wanted a headline out, that'd be really problematic, I think, in giving a really disingenuous, not from your end, but just in general from how they'd read it, perception of what people are doing when they're not working. And so I would really want to see something that would demonstrate what are we talking about in terms of people that aren't working but are somehow able to. And I know I'm asking you to open a hornet's nest there, because does a college student who doesn't want to work, is he able to? I mean, how do you define that? That'd be really difficult. But I think getting to the bottom of that would clear up a lot of the questions and discussions we have up here and be really helpful in the implementation of policy around any type of financial issue that affects those folks that aren't working. So I'd appreciate that if we could figure that out. That'd be very helpful.
Thank you, Chairman. Senator. Yeah. So what I wanted to convey here is my interpretation of these numbers is not. It's that there are obstacles and barriers that must be overcome to attract a lot of these non-participants back into the labor markets. These data, these answers to these survey questions do suggest that a lot of these non-participants are somewhat permanently detached from the labor market. It is the case that many, in increasing number, are so detached because they're simply old enough to retire and not need to work. I also wanted to bring attention to the numbers of individuals that perhaps have a detachment associated with inadequate education, not having a high school diploma. The population of individuals with disabilities are somewhat underutilized in terms of participation rates compared to the population as a whole. And then, again, I guess a surprising number of individuals with significant education that are also not in the labor market. What would it take to remove whatever barriers those individuals face, if there are barriers to their participation?
Members will take a couple more questions, and I want to make sure we give Mrs. Brower an opportunity to give her presentation. Follow up, Senator Isaacson.
Now, I took some statistics in college, so I'm enough to be dangerous, but probably not effective. So I'm going to own that up front, right? And so when I look at your numbers and it says non-participants with a bachelor's degree or higher is 276,000, do we have any idea how many of those are a part of the 651,000 that are retired?
Mr. Hine?
Yeah.
And I don't need the answer. What I'm trying to point out is any one of those by themselves really doesn't tell us anything.
121,600 or 60,
Sure.
or
And
less than
the
65.
point I'm making is that any one of those things doesn't help us because they're conflated with other crosstabs that are really important to know. And so that's just frustrating. And I'm not blaming you because I know you're just passing it out, but that's something I hope we can maybe be a little clearer about in terms of explaining that. So I think it doesn't leave us with some easy to make misunderstandings, which I really would like to avoid because it's hard enough out there when you're trying to explain everything to everybody. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
I have Senator Little, and then Draheim, and then Champion.
All right. Thank you, Chair. I want to go to the part about discouragement. You know, in a lot of surveys, you'll ask this opening question, and then you'll go through a series of questions which basically prove that the person you're polling is not telling you the actual answer. Happens all the times in political campaigns. And 0.5% just seems incredibly low. So I'm wondering if the survey has any sort of check on, or maybe you want to give me the definition of what we're calling discouragement. Because I think with the previous presenter, we heard about, you know, geography being a factor in a lot of connecting people with jobs. And so I'm wondering how expansive is discouragement and if there's any internal check on the survey as to that answer.
Mr. Hine?
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, Senator. This has been a question that's been asked for about 25 years now. It asks an individual to check off a or the reasons that they have not sought work in the last 4 weeks. And one of those is, I think the wording is perceived lack of opportunity, or do you remember? It doesn't specifically use the term discouragement, but something about a perception that there's a lack of opportunity out there. And then we, for shorthand reasons, call that. Do you have it?
This?
Do you carry this stuff around with you?
Yeah.
It doesn't add.
They reveal additional untapped potential. Oh.
Yeah, but it's,
Right.
yeah. But I think the language is fairly thoroughly vetted and has been in place and at least provides comparable measures over time.
All right. A couple quick ones. Senator Draheim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just real quick observation. To me, I don't know, do you have something in place that you review the questions you're asking? So it seems like there's a little disconnect. And I'm a freshman, so if this is a freshman question, excuse me, I apologize. But there's a little disconnect what we're looking for to make the good decisions versus the information you're collecting. Or are you interpreting this from another survey and you're just crunching the data? So I don't know. So to me, your data is only as good as the questions you're asking, but I don't know if your department's asking the questions or you're taking data from another survey that was done and then interpreting that. And I appreciate your work. Thank you.
Mr. Hine.
Sure. Chairman, Senator, I think all of the data that we are presenting here either come from, you know, the tabulations of data from records that are submitted by employers or responses to surveys that are ongoing in nature. My office relies a great deal on surveys that are conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Susan's office relies a great deal on the census and And I know Laura has presented a lot of information from the Bureau of Economic Analysis at the U.S. Department of Commerce. So we're all relying on long-standing sources of information that are compiled at the national level and broken up and provided down to the state and local level. That gives us the ability to compare ourselves to other states as we have here.
Quick follow-up, please.
Senator Draheim, follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess what I'm getting at is, this is expensive to review and collect, but if it's not helping us help the kids that aren't graduating from high school to find jobs and be a productive member of society, I guess, we need to know specific data so we can pinpoint who needs the most help so we can pass legislation to help them. And I guess that's why I was asking. I mean, do you ever sit down and have a panel to ask different questions? I guess would be my suggestion, but that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Champion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a word of caution. I don't need to repeat what others have said, but to me it's very important for us to look at the information and also think about the way that we are presenting that snapshot. Is because a snapshot will only tell you or share with you a limited view of the picture. And we live in a pretty toxic political environment, and also when people are listening, they hear this notion of non-participants that don't want work, right? And so that plays into the nexus between safety net programs and any other negative connotations and people not wanting to work. And we are just helping these people along. That sort of plays into that when a person hears that phrasing of non-participants that don't want to work without there being some way to explain it. And then guess what? The majority of people that might hear that won't stay long enough to hear what the full comprehensive answer is. And therefore, it plays into stereotypes. And it makes it much more challenging for people to get the support that they want. But lastly, we understand that the way you frame a question will drive what the answer is. So if you're asking someone if you want to work, there are lots of people that may not want to work but need to work, right? And so that, if it's not clarified, it just creates sort of what adds to a toxic environment. So I would just ask that even as you're presenting information to us as legislators, these conversations are streamed. They are that people just take small portions of them and then they run with it. And so now we have to deal with dismantling the notion that someone might hear that there's 1.2 million people who don't want to work, and we are now somehow taking care of them.
All right. Members,
if I may,
Mr. Hine, please.
Chair, Senator. Yeah, that's the language that is included in the monthly employment situation report that comes out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I naively, I'm very familiar with what it means and what its proper interpretation is. I recognize your concerns, and I will act accordingly.
All right, Mr. Hine, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Ms. Brower, please state your name for the record. Welcome to our committee. While she's getting set up, members, thank you for the great questions. It's great to have members that are engaged, and we certainly have an engaged committee, so that's great.
All right. Thank you. My name is Susan Brower. I'm the state demographer, and I work in the Department of Administration. I'm going to speak this afternoon about the demographic changes that are impacting some of our economic changes that we've been talking about today, some of the economic growth. And I prepared some materials to look back at the last few decades, but also to look ahead to see where we might be headed with respect to our demographics and how they intersect with some of these economic trends, so we can anticipate what's coming in the future. And since about 2000, Minnesota has entered a period of slower labor force growth relative to what we've seen in earlier decades. And in the coming years, we project that we will see continued slowdown. So what we're looking at here is the net change in labor force, the number of people that are added, including people who are unemployed and people who are employed. So that makes up the total of the labor force. And what you can see that we can see from this graph that in the 1980s, the labor force grew by about 40,000 people each year on average, or about 400,000 over the course of that decade. And the following decade, during the 1990s, that growth was about 54,000 each year on average. And so we've already seen a decline in the growth of the labor force down to about 24,000 people on average each year, 20,000, and we expect that that will continue into the future as the baby boomers move into retirement, and we'll look at what that looks like. I want to reiterate here that what we're looking at is continued growth of the labor force, but it's just growing at a much slower rate than we have experienced in past decades, and that we will be looking at something that is much slower than what we've experienced into the foreseeable future. I'll get why that is, why this is happening in a moment. Are there any questions on this one? I'm sorry. Can I move on? Okay. Thank you. But I'd first like to set the stage for why this matters to economic growth overall. The labor force can be broken down into two parts. So the labor force, again, is the number of people who are either working or they're actively looking for work. And those two boxes on the left are those two parts that make up the labor force. They're the number of people who are available to work, the right ages to work, and living here in Minnesota. That's the working age population. And then the rate at which they participate in the labor force. And that's the labor force participation rate, which we were looking at earlier with Steve. So together, these two components make up how many people in Minnesota go to work each day or each night to produce the goods and services that make up our economy. Because of our demographics, we are entering a period where we will see very little growth in our working age population, that first graph. And that's as the baby boomers retire. There's very little we can do to influence this box at this point, this component of growth, and that's because it's primarily determined by birth patterns 16 to 64 years ago. So what we have really, I mean, there are some things that we can do in terms of, migration can impact this a little bit, but by and large, the patterns that we're seeing in terms of labor force growth today are happening just because of the number of people we have in different age groups moving into the labor force and moving out of the labor force later in the years, in the older ages. The second component of GDP that's shown up here is labor force participation. And that will grow when the people of working age decide to move into the labor force, decide that they need a job, want a job, can have a job. But Minnesota here has very high participation rates already. If you look at the proportion of Minnesotans of working age that are employed, we're tied in a statistical tie with North Dakota as the first state. So we don't have a whole lot of room to grow across the board in terms of participation, although there may be specific groups where we can find more participation or incent people to work, incentivize work above remaining out of the labor force. I should say that we're not alone in having a slower labor force growth, in experiencing this change. This is something that is happening in many states across the U.S., particularly Midwestern states and states out toward the east, and across the globe as well. So many of the OECD countries have also either experienced this change or will do so. There's some research that says that the impact of our demographics in the U.S. is already impacting our GDP at about 1.5 percentage points annually in terms of the growth. So there's been some research that points to a dampening effect on GDP because specifically pointing to our demographics, and that's research coming out of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and there's some other work as well that has looked at that. So this isn't something that is way out in our future. It's something that we're probably already experiencing now, but it's also something that will continue going forward. The third and final component of GDP I'm not going to talk about a lot today, but it's just a growth in productivity. It's important to note that this will take on an increasingly important role as the labor force growth continues to be relatively slow. So I break it down to these basic components because I want to underscore the fundamental importance of the size and the growth of our labor force to the overall economic vitality and growth of the state. In the past, we've had more people than we could employ. We've had a surplus of people, and some of Laura's slides showed that. But that picture really has changed, and looking into the foreseeable future, we can expect that we will have relatively slow growth, barring any kind of unusual change in other kinds of patterns.
Okay, and we do have one question, Senator Goggin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Bauer, just for clarification on this slide, is this all net of all the people that come in to work in the state of Minnesota from other states like Wisconsin, Iowa, North and South Dakota? Has that all been factored in?
Ms. Brower.
Mr. Chair, Senator, when we make our labor force projections, we look at the residents of Minnesota. So no, we don't take into account in-migration of people on the borders. It's something I guess we could look into to see what the trends have looked like and whether the levels of in-migration for work have changed over time to see if that might be something that changes the picture overall. But what we look at are people residing in Minnesota.
Follow up.
Senator
what I'm getting at is the real GDP growth. I mean, have we adjusted GDP for that, for the people that live in Wisconsin, come over to Minnesota, work today, and then drive back home tonight to Wisconsin? Is that adjusted for those folks that do that?
Ms. Brower.
Do you want me to take that?
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'll take that. I'll try to take
Sure.
that question. Mr. Chairman, Senator, that's a very interesting question. I think that when you look at data on state GDP growth, it's considering what is produced in the state of Minnesota, regardless of whether those people are residents of another state. So I think that the commuting in, which I think is what you're talking about, may be imperfectly illustrated here, that we may have some people who are contributing to our GDP growth who are not part of our resident working age population and labor force participation.
And vice versa.
And vice versa, that's right. So that's exactly right. So some of the people in those blocks, the working age population who are in our labor force, they're going the other direction and they're producing output in Iowa and Wisconsin.
Thank you, Ms. Kalambokidis. Any other questions? Ms. Brower.
Thank you. Minnesota's large baby boom generation that we see in the box here, they're now, well, in 2015 were ages 51 to 69. This group has already begun to move into retirement ages, and many have begun to move into retirement. If you look at the blue portion of each of those bars, you can see the share that is in the labor force, and the gray proportion is the share that is out of the labor force. And you can see that labor force participation drops off relatively quickly after about the mid-60s and continues into the older years. I also want to point to the kind of age structure here of our workforce, that we have a relatively large proportion that are in those older ages. We have a small cohort of people who are in the middle years, mid-career, in their 40s, and a much larger share, again, in their 20s and early 30s. And so what we're experiencing with this labor force slowdown and the projected slowdown is just kind of the natural movement of that group out of the labor force into the retirement years, that group being the baby boomers. And while we have a relatively large share of young workers coming in, it's still not enough to both replace the baby boomers who are retiring and make up for additional growth on top of that. And so you have this dampening effect of those of the overall labor force because of the retirements at the older ages. We have seen some change in the share of older adults that are participating in the labor force. We've seen older adults stay working longer than we have in the past. The dark blue line here is showing you labor force participation. This is for Minnesota across different age groups. And you can see that in 1990, in the blue line there, that the share of older adults who were working was lower than it is today. You can see that that line has progressively lifted, but overall the shape still holds, and that points to a really stable pattern of a lot of work happening, you know, when people are in between ages 22 to their early 60s, but there's a pretty steep drop-off that happens, and that has increased a bit, but the overall picture is still movement out of the labor force, by and large, for the majority of older adults. I mentioned earlier that our labor force grew by about 20,000 people on average for the first part of the current decade. I want to show you now where that growth is coming from. The numbers in this graph are showing you the change over 4 years rather than an annual average, but we're looking here at the change in Minnesota's labor force, in the size of the labor force, by broad racial categories and birthplace. So whether our workers are white, non-Hispanic, or people of color, and whether they were born in the US or abroad. And you can see here that the change in the size of the white US-born population has been negative. That means there's been a decline in the size of white workers in Minnesota since 2011 by about 13,000. And we've seen growth among both US-born populations of color, workers of color, and foreign-born workers of color, and to a lesser extent, white foreign-born workers. So growth is coming primarily from populations of color and immigrants in our state. And this is something that is already occurring, but is also projected to occur into the future. Part of the reason why we can expect this to continue to happen into the future is just because of our age structure, that we have younger workers who are more likely to be people of color. You can see here in our 16 to 19-year-old labor force group that about a quarter of the workers are people of color, compared with only about 5% of older workers in 65 to 69-year-old age group. So we know that the workforce will become more diverse as older workers who are largely white, non-Hispanic move out of the labor force, and in their place, younger workers age into the workforce who are much more diverse. I want to point out that while many of our people of color in Minnesota and many of our immigrant residents here live in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, that for labor force growth among populations of color and workers of color, and also our immigrants in Minnesota, is really something that has an impact statewide. On the left graph, you can see here that between 2008 and 2013, the majority of counties in the state experienced a loss in their white, non-Hispanic workforce. So the number of workers declined in those counties that you see up there that are red, the number of workers who were white, non-Hispanic. And on the right, you can see the counties that are green are counties where workers of color increased. And so this is something that has broad impact geographically, the change that I'm describing. Finally, as we look ahead to the future, we can expect that our growth will be dampened just by our age structure. And so the blue bar up here is showing you the natural change in Minnesota. Right now we're looking at the whole population, not just the labor force. But if we look ahead, we can see that it will be much harder to grow without the impact of migration. And that's just because we have a relatively older population and a population that will be growing older. And so it's projected that we'll have more births than deaths by the period up there of 2040 that I'm showing you. And at that point, our population would either decline or migration would make up for that lost growth. And so looking back, wrapping up here, Minnesota's slow labor force growth is likely to be constrained, could be constrained in the years ahead because of what we expect for labor force growth. This is a relatively new situation for us compared to the last few decades that we were looking at, and it's something that we are likely to experience into the future if there's not a major demographic change that happens in our state. And looking forward, people of color and immigrants are also likely to play an important role in the continued growth of our labor force.
Thank you, Ms. Brower. Any questions, members? If not, Ms. Kalambokidis, Mr. Hine, and Ms. Brower, thank you so much for your testimony. Very interesting. And members, if you have additional questions, I'm sure any of the three would be happy to answer them at a later time. Otherwise, our next committee meeting is this Wednesday, January 25th, and we're going to have testimony from small and mid-sized businesses from here in Minnesota. So with that said, committee is adjourned.